Good day everyone. Ang topic natin for today is about the Republic Act 9147 or the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. Republic Act 9147 was submitted during the 11th Congress and then eventually it was approved on July 30 of the same year 2001 and it was signed by the then President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. The complete title of RA 9147 is an act providing for the conservation and protection of wildlife resources and their habitats, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes. Yung other title naman ng batas na ito ay yung Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. So, ano yung declaration of policy? The state shall conserve and protect wildlife species and their habitats to promote ecological balance and enhance biological diversity. The policy of the state to regulate the collection and trade of wildlife species. To pursue with due regard to the national interest, so yung commitment ng Pilipinas doon sa international convention such as the protection of wildlife in their habitats and to initiate support scientific studies on the conservation of biological diversity. So the provisions of this act shall be enforceable for all wildlife species found in all areas of the country, including the protected areas under the RA 7586 or the NIPAS Act and the RA 11038 or the INAIPAS Act and their critical habitats. So hindi lang doon sa mga native o endemic species apply itong batas na to, kundi pati na rin sa mga exotic species which are subject to trade, cultured, maintained, or bred in capacity or propagated in the country. So, in terms of Section 4, ano-ano ba ang jurisdiction ng DENR at ang DA or Department of Agriculture? According to the RA 9147, ang jurisdiction ng DENR ay ang lahat ng terrestrial plants kasama na ang mga animal species including yung turtle and tortoises and wetland species including but not limited to kasama yung mga crocodiles, water birds, all amphibians and dugongs shall be the responsibility of protection by the DENR. Ano naman ngayon yung jurisdiction ng sa Department of Agriculture through the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources? So lahat ng declared aquatic critical habitats, lahat ng aquatic resources, including but not limited to all fishes, aquatic plants, invertebrates, and all marine mammals except dugong. So yung mga sharks, no? Yung mga seals, ano pa yung mga marine mammals, yung mga whales, dolphins, ang may jurisdiction dyan ay ang DA to the BFAR. In Palawan, meron tayong tinatawag na PCST or Palawan Council for Sustainable Development kung saan it was enacted pursuant to Republic Act number 7611 or the Strategic Environment of Palawan kung saan ang PCST ang binibigyan ng mandato para protektahan ang lahat ng wildlife species dito sa Palawan. So the secretaries ng DENR at DA shall review and by joint administrative order revise and regularly update the list of species under respective jurisdiction. So sa Palawan, ang Palawan ay nag-update din sila. Meron din silang updated list ng mga rare, threatened, and endangered terrestrial and aquatic species. Section 5 is merong mga iba't ibang klaseng terms na ginagamit. So, ang unang term dyan is yung tinatawag nating bioprospecting. Ano ba ang bioprospecting? Ang bioprospecting means the research, collection, and utilization of biological and genetic resources for the purpose of applying the knowledge derived therefrom solely for commercial purposes. So, isang example niya, nag-research sila kung ano yung mga posibleng pharmacological products derived from, for example, pag-research kung substances pa na galing sa cucumber or substances pa na galing sa jellyfish ay mayroon bang antimicrobial or antiviral properties na pwedeng gamitin as a drug in the future. The next definition is the conservation. So what is conservation? Conservation means preservation and sustainable utilization of wildlife and or maintenance, restoration, enhancement of the habitat. So critically endangered species, they refers to a species or subspecies that is facing extremely high risk of extinction in the wild in the future, ay immediate future kapag hindi sila na protektahan. Endemic species or subspecies na naturally occurring lang or nakikita lang sa isang area, sa isang specific area, and they cannot be found elsewhere. So, pwede siyang country endemic, province endemic, or locality endemic. And pag sinabi natin exotic species, sila yung mga species or subspecies na they do not naturally occur doon sa area. Nag-exist lang sila because they are being introduced by human, either accidentally or intentionally. So, ano ba ang gratuitous permit? So, yung gratuitous permit ay mga permit na in-issue sa mga individual na tao or entity na nag-engage sa non-commercial, scientific, or educational undertaking to collect wildlife. So, for example, ikaw ay estudyante. For example, may thesis ka. And yung thesis mo ay nag-require para mag-collecta ng wildlife, either for laboratory purposes. So, kailangan mo kumuha ng gratuitous permit. The next important definition is the traditional use, utilization of wildlife by indigenous people in accordance with the written or unwritten rules, usage, customs, and practices traditionally observed, accepted, and recognized by them. So, wildlife means wild forms and varieties of flora and fauna in all developmental stages, including those which are in captivity or being bred or propagated. A wildlife collector's permit is a permit to take or collect from the wild certain species and quantities of wildlife for commercial purposes. What is wildlife farm or culture permit? So, ang permit na ito ay binibigay para i-develop, mag-operate, or i-maintain ang wildlife breeding farm for preservation, trade, and or scientific purposes. So, Section 7 about the collection of wildlife. The collection of wildlife may be allowed in accordance with Section 6 of this Act, provided na ang collection ng wildlife ay gagamitan ng appropriate and acceptable wildlife collection techniques with least or no detrimental effects to the existing wildlife populations, and their habitat shall likewise be required. So the collection of wildlife by indigenous peoples or IPs may be allowed for traditional use and not primarily for trade. The collection and utilization for said purpose shall not cover threatened species. So Section 8 about the possession of wildlife. No person or entity shall be allowed possession of wildlife unless such person or entity can prove financial and technical capability and a facility to maintain said wildlife. What does the Section 9 of RA 9147 says? Collection and or possession of byproducts and derivatives. Now, byproducts and derivatives may be collected and or processed, provided that the source was not obtained in violation of this Act. Section 10. Local transport of wildlife, byproducts, and derivatives. Ano ibig sabihin nun? The local transport of wildlife, byproducts, and derivatives collected or possessed through any means shall be authorized unless the same is prejudicial to the wildlife and public health. So, Section 11. Exploitation and or importation of wildlife. The wildlife species may be exported to or imported from another country as may be authorized by the Secretary or the designated representative, subject to strict compliance with the provisions of this Act and the rules regulations promulgated pursuant thereto. So, provided that the recipient of the wildlife is technically and financially capable to maintain it. So, Section 12 is about the introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of endemic or indigenous wildlife. The introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of endemic and indigenous wildlife shall be allowed only for population enhancement or recovery purposes, subject to the prior clearance from the Secretary or the authorized representative pursuant to Section 6 of this Act. So, pwede mag-introduce or mag-reintroduce ng mga or mag-restock ng mga endemic and indigenous wildlife species. Pero kailangan pa ng approval. Any proposed introduction shall be subject to scientific study which shall focus on the bioecology. The proponent shall also conduct public consultations with concerned individuals or entities. Section 13. Ano ba ang sinasabi ng RA 9147 about sa introduction ng exotic wildlife? As much as possible, ipinagbabawal ang pag-introduce ng exotic species sa Pilipinas unless may clearance galing sa Secretary or ng authorized representative, and as much as possible, no exotic species shall be introduced into protected areas covered by RA 75/75/86 and RA 11038 and to critical habitats under Section 25 thereof. In cases where introduction is allowed, it shall be subject to environmental impact study which shall focus on the bioecology, socioeconomic, and related aspects of the area where the species will be introduced. So Section 14, inalaw ang bioprospecting sa Pilipinas upon execution of an undertaking by any proponent, stipulating therein its compliance with a commitment to reasonable terms and conditions that may be imposed by the Secretary which are necessary to protect biological diversity. So Section 15, about the scientific researches on wildlife, the collection and utilization of biological resources for scientific research and not for commercial purposes shall be allowed Secretary or the authorized representative, provided na before magkaroon ng scientific researches on wildlife, ay kumuha muna ng clearance from the concerned bodies before magkakaroon ng issuance of gratuitous permit. Section 16, Biosafety. All activities dealing on genetic engineering and pathogenic organisms in the Philippines, as well as activities requiring the importation, introduction, field release, and breeding of organisms that are potentially harmful to man and the environment, shall be reviewed in accordance with the biosafety guidelines, ensuring public welfare and the protection and conservation of wildlife and their habitats. The breeding or propagation of wildlife for commercial purposes shall be allowed by the Secretary or the authorized representative pursuant to Section 6 to the issuance of wildlife farm culture permit, provided that only progenies, o sinabi natin progenies, yung mga anak ng wildlife ay i-raised, as well as unproductive parent stock shall be utilized for trade. Provided further that commercial breeding operations for wildlife, whenever appropriate, shall be subject to an environmental study impact. Section 20. The authority of the Secretary to issue permits. The Secretary or the duly authorized representative, in order to effectively implement this Act, shall issue permits, certifications, clearances with corresponding period of validity whenever appropriate, which shall include but not limited to the following. Validity. So, yung wildlife farm or culture permit, ang validity niyan ay from 3 to 5 years. Ang wildlife collector's permit, ang validity niyan ay from 1 to 3 years. Ang gratuitous permit ay for 1 year. Ang local transport permit, ang validity niyan is from 1 to 3 months, at an export, import, or export permit, ang validity niyan ay from 1 to 6 months. So, yung Section 22, Determination of Threatened Species. The Secretary shall determine whether any wildlife species or subspecies is threatened and classify the same as critically endangered, vulnerable, or other accepted categories based on the best scientific data and with due regard to international accepted criteria, including but not limited to the following: present or threatened destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range. Number 2, overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. And number 3, inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms and other natural or man-made factors affecting the existence of the wildlife. Section 23 is about the collection of wildlife, threatened wildlife, byproducts, and derivatives. The collection of threatened wildlife, as determined in listed pursuant to this Act, including its byproducts and derivatives, shall be allowed only for scientific or breeding or propagation purposes in accordance with Section 6 of this Act, provided that only the accredited individuals, business, research, educational, or scientific entities shall be allowed to collect or conserve for conservation, breeding, or propagation. The conservation, breeding, or propagation of threatened species shall be encouraged in order to enhance its population in its natural habitat. It shall be done simultaneously with the rehabilitation and or protection of the habitat where the captive breed or propagation species shall be released, reintroduced, or restocked. Section 26 is about the registration of threatened and exotic wildlife in the possession of private persons. No persons or entity shall be allowed possession of wildlife unless such person or entity can prove financial and technical capability and facility to maintain said wildlife. However, when the threatened species is needed for breeding, propagation, or research purposes, the state may acquire the wildlife through a mutually acceptable arrangement. After the period set has elapsed, threatened wildlife possessed without certificate of registration shall be confiscated in favor of the government, subject to the penalties herein provided. Section 27. Ano ba yung ipinagbabawal according to RA 9147? It shall be unlawful for any person to willfully exploit wildlife resources in their habitats or undertake the following acts: killing and destroying wildlife species, except in the following instances: when it is done as part ng religious ritual of established tribal groups or indigenous cultural communities. Kapag ang wildlife ay may sakit na hindi nagagaling, okay lang na patayin siya in an acceptable way. Okay, kunyari, nakahawa yung sakit, wala ng gamot, pwede yung patayin yung mercy killing or euthanasia yung wildlife organism. Yan. Kapag sobrang nahihirapan nyo na yung wildlife, for example, nasagasaan, tapos nag-aagaw buhay, so ayaw mo na siya makita nahihirapan. So pag pinatay mo siya, hindi ka mapaparusahan ng batas. No? Kapag, for example, nakita mo nakatalikod or walang malay yung isang tao at nakita mo aatakihin siya ng, let's say, mabangis na hayop, and ikaw nakita mo yun, may dala kang let's say itak or ng baril, binaril mo siya, so exemption yun kasi pinagtanggol mo yung buhay ng tao na pwedeng mawakasan dahil sa pag-atake ng wild animals na yon. When the wildlife is killed or destroyed after it has been used in authorized research or experiments. Okay, so ano pa yung mga ipinagbabawal? Kapag sinaktan kung saan napilay or nalumpo and hindi na makapanganak yung mga wildlife species, bawal yun. Ano pa yung mga ipinagbabawal? Kapag nagtapon ng mga waste products doon sa mga tinitirhan ng mga wildlife. So, ano pa? Yung mga critical habitat kung saan nakatira yung mga wildlife na yun, in-squat or tinayuan na walang paalam, na walang dokumento, ipinagbabawal yun. Pagkakaroon ng mineral exploration or extraction sa non-critical habitats kung saan nakatira yung mga wildlife, so ipinagbabawal din yun. Yung kaingin o yung burning ng forest kung saan usually yung tirahan ng mga wildlife, so ipinagbabawal. Logging, so puputol ng mga kahoy especially sa mga critical habitats kung saan nakatira yung mga wildlife, at yung quarrying. So, yung quarrying, yung pagkuha ng mga let's say, an example ng mga graba o ng buhangin kung saan posibleng yun yung habitat ng mga wildlife species natin. Reintroduction or wildlife resources, trading of wildlife, collecting, hunting, or possessing wildlife, their byproducts and derivatives. So, gathering or destroying of active nest trees, coastlands, and the likes, maltreating and inflicting other injuries not covered by the preceding paragraph, and transporting of wildlife. Ano ba yung penalties para sa mga violation? Doon sa act. So, for any person who undertakes illegal acts under paragraph A, so ano ba yung paragraph A? Yung killing or destroying wildlife of the immediate preceding section to any species as may be categorized pursuant to this act, the following penalties and fines shall be imposed. Kapag pinatay or sinira ang critically endangered species, offender ay makukulong from 6 years and 1 day up to 12 years at magkakaroon ng fines na 100,000 to 1 million. Kung ang wildlife naman ay endangered species na ang category, makukulong siya ng 4 years and 1 day up to 6 years at magbabayad siya ng 50,000 to 500,000. Kung ang wildlife na pinatay o sinira ay vulnerable species lang, makukulong siya ng 2 years and 1 day up to 4 years at magbabayad siya ng 30,000 hanggang 300,000 pesos. Kung ang species na pinatay or destroy ay threatened species lang, makukulong yung offender ng 1 year and 1 day up to 2 years at pagmumultahin siya ng 20,000 to 200,000 pesos. Kung ibang wildlife species, ibig sabihin hindi sila categorized as threatened, endangered, critically endangered, makukulong from 6 months and 1 day hanggang 1 taon at pagbumultahin ng 10,000 hanggang 100,000 pesos.